In 2019, a woman in Coventry cleared her mother's kitchen and took 4 old pans to a car boot. She sold the lot for a tenner. One of them was a Kenrick No. 8 skillet, and a dealer 2 stalls along bought it quietly, drove it straight to a specialist auction, and it made £240 before the morning was out. She didn't know the name. Now you will. I've been doing this long enough to have made every version of that mistake myself, which is probably why it still bothers me. Not the selling cheap. That happens. But the not knowing. Because with cast iron, not knowing is optional. The information is right there on the base of the pan if you know what you're reading. That's what this is about. We're going through 10 names, specific makers, specific marks, specific values. By the end, you'll have a method and a list, which is more than most dealers will give you in a year. Why cast iron holds value. When almost nothing else does. Most things you find in a cleared kitchen have a shelf life. Ceramics chip, tin rusts through, wooden handles split and shrink and crack. Cast iron does none of those things. It corrodes on the surface, yes, but the iron itself doesn't deteriorate the way softer metals do. A pan cast in Birmingham in 1880 is structurally the same object today as it was then. The mass hasn't changed. The form hasn't changed. The mark on the base, if it was struck cleanly, hasn't changed. That's the first rule. Cast iron doesn't rot, so age survives and maker identity survives with it. Which means a pan in a skip can outperform a new one from a shop, not because of nostalgia, not because of cooking performance, although that argument has its own people, but because the manufacturing history of British cast iron foundries is traceable, documented, and finite. These companies are gone. No new old stock is appearing. Every piece in circulation is the total supply. British foundries were also creatures of habit in ways that work in your favour. They changed their marks at specific moments. When a company was bought, when a patent lapsed, when they moved premises, when the founder's son took over and decided to put his own initial on the gate. Those changes can date a pan with a precision you don't normally get from kitchenware. Not to the exact year, always, but often to a decade or a 15-year window. Hallmarks on silverwork on the same principle. The assay office changed the date letter and the town mark at set intervals, so you can read the base and know when the piece was made. Cast iron foundry marks function identically, just with less official documentation behind them and more work required to learn the system. That matters for value because earlier production runs from the major makers are scarcer, and the foundry mark is often your only way to confirm you're holding one. A Kenrick pan from the 1870s is worth considerably more than one from the 1920s, even if they look identical on the outside and are the same nominal size. The mark tells you which decade you're in. So learning to read the base isn't just identification, it's dating, and dating is pricing. The bottom inspection, what you're actually looking for. Before we get into any names, you need the physical routine, because it's the same for everything on this list. 30 seconds, every time. Turn it over. That's it, that's the whole method. But let me tell you what to look for once it's upside down. The first thing you're checking for is the gate mark. This is a raised line, usually running straight across the base or curving slightly, sometimes trimmed down close to the surface, sometimes left quite prominent. It's the trace of where molten iron was fed into the mould. British foundry practice through much of the 19th century left a visible gate mark on the base. After roughly 1890, most of the larger makers switched to a different moulding technique. The parting line moved to the side of the handle, or the base was machined flat. So a strong gate mark is often, though not always, a sign you're holding something pre-1890. Not a guarantee, but a prompt to look harder. Next to or near the gate mark, or sometimes on the side wall near the handle, you're looking for the foundry stamp. This can be raised letters, proud of the surface, or it can be incised, pressed into the iron during casting. Raised is more common on the older British pieces. The stamp might be a full company name. Kenrick, Falkirk and Salter. It might be initials. It might be a town name followed by initials. It might be a patent number that looks, if you're in a hurry, exactly like a mould waste stamp. just a cluster of numbers that you'd be tempted to dismiss. 2 of the 10 names on this list have marks that are very easy to misread as exactly that. Foundry waste numbers, meaningless to the untrained eye, worth nothing. I'll tell you which 2 when we get to them, and I'll tell you what distinguishes the real mark from the junk. Also check the size number. British makers cast their size numbers into the base as a rule, though the numbering systems are not standardized across makers, and this causes a great deal of confusion. I'll deal with that separately, because it's important enough to deserve its own explanation. Finally, run your thumb across the cooking surface when you flip it back. The very early British skillets were sand-cast and hand-finished. The surface is never completely smooth, but there's a quality to the finish on a well-made Victorian piece, a fineness to the grain, that's different from a later, cruder casting. Won't always tell you the maker. We'll tell you something about age and care in production. That's the inspection. Turn it over, find the gate mark, find the stamp, find the size number, 30 seconds. Do it every time, before you price it, before you pass on it, before you put it back on the shelf. Pans 1 to 3. The ones you'll find most often, Kenrick first, Archibald Kenrick and Sons, West Bromwich. This is the name you'll encounter most frequently if you're working the Midland circuit, and a fair bit elsewhere too, because Kenrick was one of the largest hardware manufacturers in Victorian Britain. They made everything from hinges to door knockers to hollow ware, and their cast iron pans were distributed through ironmongers and hardware shops across the country for most of the 19th and into the 20th century. Common? Yes. Worthless? No. The Kenrick stamp on older pieces, from the 1860s through to roughly the 1890s, reads either Kenrick or A. Kenrick and Sons, in raised letters on the base, often accompanied by West Bromwich in a separate line. That full 3-line mark is what you want. Later pieces carry a simpler stamp, and in some cases a small trademark motif, but the earlier full-name mark is the one that dates the pan to the earlier production period and commands the stronger prices. A standard Kenrick skillet in decent condition, size 6 or 8, which were the most common domestic sizes, will make between £40 and £90 at specialist auction or through a cast-iron dealer. That's not a fortune, but it's not a car boot price either. Where Kenrick gets serious is in the less common sizes and the less common forms. The No. 2 Kenrick skillet, which is a small piece, and the No. 10, which is very large, both appear rarely. The No. 2 has sold for over £150 in clean condition. The No. 10, when it turns up, tends to make between 100 and 200 depending on the stamp and the surface. There's also a Kenrick basting spoon ladle form and a matching dripping pan that surface occasionally, with the same stamp, and those tend to be undervalued by people who are only looking for skillets. Bear that in mind. Salter next. George Salter and Company, West Bromwich again. The Midlands was the heart of British cast iron production, which is one of the reasons I ended up knowing about this stuff. Salter is better known today for their scales, and that's where most people's knowledge stops. But they produced hollowware, including skillets and saucepans, and their cast iron work carries the same Salter stamp, sometimes accompanied by West Bromwich, sometimes just the name and a patent number. Salter cast iron is less commonly found than Kenrick, which makes the average piece slightly more interesting to a collector, but the values are roughly comparable for common sizes. £40 to £100 for standard skillets. The thing with Salter is that their pieces appeared less often in the mass domestic market and more often in commercial and institutional settings, hotel kitchens, school cookhouses, that kind of context. Which means when you do find them in a house clearance, they sometimes turn up in unusual sizes made for large-scale cooking, and those are the ones worth pausing on. Third name in this opening group. Staffordshire Foundry pieces stamped Braidley or W.H. Bradley from the Bilston area. Bradley pieces are well known to specialists, but barely register with general dealers, which is exactly the situation that creates value gaps. The common Bradley skillet sizes go for £50 to £80. But here's the specific detail I mentioned. The Bradley No. 5 is a non-standard size that Bradley produced differently across two distinct periods. The earlier version, identifiable by a slightly thicker wall casting and the absence of a helper handle, is worth roughly 4 times the later version. I've seen the earlier No. 5 make £220. I've seen the later version make 55. Both carry the same Bradley stamp. The wall thickness and the helper handle are the distinguishing features, and I'll come back to that when I explain why two identical-looking marks can produce such different prices. The size problem. Why two pans with identical marks can be miles apart in value. The numbering systems British foundries used are not standardized, and I want to be direct about this because it trips people up constantly. When you turn over a pan and see the number 6 on the base, you might assume that means something consistent. A number 6 is a certain diameter, a certain capacity, a certain size. It doesn't. A Kenrick No. 6 and a Bradley No. 6 are not the same diameter. A Falkirk No. 6 and a Salter No. 6 are not the same weight. Each foundry ran its own sizing system, and those systems developed independently over decades, adjusted to suit their own mold stock and their own customer contracts. What this means practically is that you cannot value a pan from the size number alone. You need the maker's name, the size number, and ideally the actual measurement, because even within a single maker's range, the value distribution across sizes is wildly uneven. Common sizes, the ones that went into ordinary domestic kitchens, that were sold through ironmongers' shops by the thousand, are worth less than the sizes that were made in small runs for specific purposes. One of the rarest sizes in the whole list today was made for a single industrial contract. It didn't go into domestic kitchens, it went into factory canteens or institutional kitchens, probably in the 1880s and 1890s, in numbers that were small relative to the domestic output. When production ended, the mold was retired. The pieces that exist are the pieces that survived. And because they look, to the untrained eye, like ordinary pans, same mark, same basic form, just an unusual size, they end up at car boot prices with some regularity. I'll name the specific maker and size when we get to the relevant section, because it'll mean more once you have the broader context. The rule to take from this section: the number on the base tells you the maker's internal classification. Nothing more. Until you know that maker's sizing system, the number means nothing on its own. Learn the maker, then learn their numbers. Pans 4 to 7. The names that dealers don't mention in front of you. Falkirk Iron Company, Falkirk, Scotland. This is where things start to get interesting, and also where the geography shifts, because not everything worth finding came out of the West Midlands. Falkirk was producing cast iron from the late 18th century, and their range included hollowware, cookware, and architectural pieces. The foundry mark on Falkirk pans is typically a raised stamp reading Falkirk, sometimes with iron CO below, and occasionally with a catalogue or pattern number. The raised lettering on genuine Falkirk pieces from the mid to late Victorian period has a particular characteristic. The F tends to have a slightly wider top bar than the other capitals, and the spacing between letters is tighter than you'd expect. This sounds like a minor detail. It matters because there is a reproduction in circulation, not a recent one, it's been around since at least the late 1990s, where the Falkirk mark has been applied to a modern casting. The reproduction has a filed mark. You can see, if the light catches it right, that the stamp has been partially smoothed and restruck, slightly proud of the surface in a way that genuine cast marks are not. The original stamping is part of the casting. A filed mark sits differently. It feels different under your thumb if you run it slowly across the letters. Falkirk skillets in genuine Victorian production, common sizes, go for £60 to £120. The less common sizes and the deeper forms, a Falkirk saucepan rather than a flat skillet, go higher, sometimes into the 200s at specialist sales. The reproduction, obviously, is worth what the iron weighs. Fifth name. Carron Company, also Scottish, also significant. Carron was one of the oldest iron foundries in Britain, established in 1759, and while their production was vast and varied, they made the carronade naval cannon, among other things. Their domestic hollowware carries a distinctive mark. The Carron stamp, or sometimes Carron CO with a location mark, appears on skillets, griddle plates, and saucepans from the mid-Victorian period onward. The pieces themselves are often beautifully made. Carron had long established metallurgical skills, and the cooking surfaces on Carron skillets are frequently finer than equivalents from smaller foundries. Carron pieces have been rising steadily in collector interest over the past decade. A standard Carron skillet that would have made £40 at a specialist sale in 2010 now makes 80 to 120 fairly routinely. The larger Carron forms, number 8 and number 9 skillets, have been making 150 to 200 at the better specialist auctions. If you find a Carron piece marked clearly and in reasonable condition, it's not one to price at a fiver. 6th, Coalbrookdale Company from Shropshire, which makes it practically a home county for me. Coalbrookdale is world famous for its architectural and ornamental iron. The museum at Iron Bridge covers the history thoroughly. What's less discussed outside specialist circles is their domestic cookware production, which ran alongside the decorative work and used the same high-quality iron. Coalbrookdale cookware carries a Coalbrookdale CO stamp, occasionally a CBDC monogram mark on the very early pieces, and is considerably less common than Kenrick or Salter in general circulation. Values reflect that. A Coalbrookdale skillet with a clean, legible mark has made between £150 and £300 at specialist auction, depending on size and condition. I've seen a deep Coalbrookdale casserole form, more of a round pot than a flat pan, make over £400. These are not everyday finds, but they surface in house clearances in the Shropshire and Worcestershire areas with enough regularity that it's worth knowing the name. 7th, and this is the first of the names that most viewers won't have encountered, Ynyscedwyn Ironworks from Ynyscedwyn in the Brecon Beacons area of South Wales. I know it's a mouthful, and I can hear the Midlanders bristling, but Welsh iron production in the Victorian period was substantial and technically accomplished, and Ynyscedwyn pieces are genuinely scarce in general circulation because the foundry's output was regionally distributed and didn't reach the national networks the Midlands and Scottish makers used. The stamp, where it appears, reads Ynyscedwyn or YCW, sometimes in very shallow relief that can look, at first glance, like mould waste lettering. That's one of the 2 marks I flagged earlier that are easy to dismiss as meaningless numbers. Run your thumb along it carefully. If you can feel distinct letter forms rather than random numerals or a casting reference, you're looking at a foundry name. Get it into better light and look again. Ynyscedwyn pieces that have been correctly identified have sold for between £180 and £400, because the scarcity is real and the collector base knows it. The pieces that get sold for nothing are the ones where the shallow relief mark gets glanced at once and filed away as meaningless. Now you know it's not. Reading condition. Honestly, what rust means and what it doesn't. My Uncle Derek had a rule, and I've repeated it enough times in my life that it's become mine too. Never sneer at rust, because rust means age, and age means value if you know what you're looking at. He was right, and I didn't always follow his advice early on, and it cost me. I'll tell you about one specific instance. There was a clearance house I used to visit in Telford, a large unit off the industrial estate, run by a man called Barry, who bought house contents by the van load and let dealers pick through on Thursday mornings. Good hunting ground, usually. One Thursday there was a box of kitchen ironware near the back, clearly out of someone's scullery. Heavy muck, surface rust across the whole lot, the kind of condition that makes your hands dirty just picking things up. I went through most of the box. I picked up one piece, a skillet, turned it briefly, couldn't read the base through the grime, put it down. Decided the condition was too far gone to bother cleaning on spec. 3 weeks later, someone in the same collector network mentioned picking up a very clean Carron skillet from a clearance house near Telford. Number 9. They'd wire-brushed the base, read the mark, and sold it at auction for £162 the following Saturday. Same Thursday, same Barry, same filthy box. That was my pan. I'd held it and put it down because I was lazy about the condition and didn't do the inspection properly. I don't make that particular mistake anymore. Here is the condition hierarchy as it actually works for cast iron, not as people assume it does. Surface rust is cosmetically unpleasant and structurally irrelevant. Iron rusts. Victorian iron has had 140 years to accumulate surface oxidation, kitchen grease, and general muck. None of that tells you anything about the underlying metal or the mark. Wire brushing, or electrolytic cleaning if you have the setup, will remove surface rust without damaging the casting. A pan that looks terminally rough at first glance is frequently fine underneath. Pitting is a different matter. Deep pitting means the iron has corroded inward in localized spots, and if pitting is extensive across the cooking surface, it affects both usability and collector value. But even moderate pitting on the exterior doesn't necessarily mean pitting on the cooking face, and the base, where the mark is usually less exposed to moisture than the cooking surface. Cracks are the one condition issue that genuinely affects value significantly. A hairline crack in a cast iron pan is structural. It won't usually cause immediate failure, but collectors know it, dealers price around it, and at auction it will suppress a piece considerably. Always check the interior surface with decent light for hairline cracks, especially radiating from the handle joint, which is the most common stress point. Buildup. Old polymerized cooking fat, carbon, the black crust that accumulates over decades of use, is completely removable and means nothing about value. Some people see a heavily seasoned old pan with a thick black coating and think the surface is damaged. It isn't. That coat often comes off to reveal a surface in excellent condition. The muck on the outside is not the story. Pans 8 to 10, the rarest marks, the highest values, and one name most people walk past. 8th, Robinson & Sons, Dudley, West Midlands. This is not a name that appears in general antique guides. It's known within the cast iron collector community, and essentially nowhere else, which is precisely the condition that produces value gaps at car boot sales and in charity shops. Robinson & Sons produced hollow ware from the 1860s through to the early 20th century, and their skillets are distinguished by two features that, once you've seen them, you don't forget. The first is the handle profile. Robinson pieces tend to have a slightly upswept handle with a small raised rib along the top side, which is unusual among British makers of the period. Most British Victorian skillets have flat handles. The Robinson rib is a physical tell you can find by touch in the dark. The second is the mark itself, which reads Robinson & Sons, Dudley, in 2 lines on the base, sometimes with a patent number below. The letters are typically incised rather than raised, which is unusual for British makers of that era and is probably why it gets dismissed. Incised marks look less authoritative than raised ones, and people assume they're looking at a secondary or commercial grade piece rather than a named maker. Robinson & Sons skillets in documented condition have sold at specialist cast iron auctions for between £260 and £480. The higher prices are for the less common sizes, particularly the number 3, which was apparently made in limited numbers and turns up very rarely, and for pieces where both the handle rib and the base mark are in good condition. 9th, Leys Malleable Castings Company, Derby. Leys is another name from outside the Midlands Foundry heartland that tends to slip through the net. Their work includes a range of domestic hollow ware produced in the late Victorian and Edwardian periods, and the pieces are technically very good. The walls are generally thinner and more even than the mid-century Midlands output, reflecting improvements in casting technique by the 1890s. The Leys stamp, sometimes accompanied by Derby or a patent reference, appears on a range of skillet and saucepan forms. The value of Leys pieces has been driven partly by the cooking community, people who use these pans rather than just collect them, because the thinner wall and finer surface make them genuinely excellent to cook with, which has brought a second audience to the market beyond collectors. That dual demand has pushed prices upward. A Leys skillet in clean condition, common sizes, makes £100 to £160. The larger forms, number 8 and above, have been making over 200 at recent sales. The specific industrial contract size I mentioned earlier, the one made almost exclusively for institutional kitchens, is the Leys number 11. This is an unusually large cooking size, larger than the standard domestic range ended at number 9, and it appears in the Leys catalogue in very limited numbers, almost certainly for the institutional market. It doesn't come up often. When it does, it tends to be priced like a large, unremarkable pan rather than what it is, a documented scarce production size from a named maker. The few that have reached specialist auction have made between £300 and £520. At a car boot or a house clearance, it's priced as a large pan with a slightly unusual mark, because the size number alone, 11, doesn't signal scarcity to someone who doesn't know the Leys range. 10th, and this is the one I want you to sit with for a moment, because it illustrates exactly why the name on a pan matters more than the look of it. The 10th name is British Anzani. I know, it sounds like an engineering company. Because it was. British Anzani Engineering Company, Hampton Hill, Middlesex, produced motorcycle and aircraft engines in the early 20th century. They're in the history books for the engines, not for cookware. But they also produced, through an associated foundry operation, a range of cast iron hollowware in the 1920s and 30s that carries their name on the base. The reason is not entirely clear from the available records, but it appears to relate to wartime and immediate post-war production when British manufacturing of all kinds was opportunistically diversified. What matters is that the pieces exist, they're documented, and they carry the British Anzani stamp in raised letters on the base. Because the name sounds industrial, because it sounds exactly like something you'd stamp on a gearbox rather than a skillet, almost nobody who encounters one at a sale or clearance identifies it as a collectible cast iron piece. It gets priced as a sturdy old pan with an odd mark, and it sells for what the iron weighs. I've bought 3 of them over the years. I paid between £2 and £8 for each of them. The most recent British Anzani skillet to go through a specialist cast iron auction, a number 7, in good condition with a clean mark, made £940. That's documented. There are examples of the deeper saucepan form from the same maker that have exceeded £1,100 when they've reached the right room and the right bidders. The mark is not obscure once you know it. The name is not ambiguous once you know it. The pan is not rare-looking once you know what you're holding. But until you know, it looks exactly like an old industrial-era pan with a functional-sounding stamp, and you price it accordingly. That's the gap. That's where knowing the name is worth real money. The one rule that covers all 10. I've given you 10 names, specific marks, specific forms, specific sizes to look for. If you've taken notes or you're going to come back to this, that list has value on its own. But a list without a method is just 10 things to memorize, and memorizing things has never been how I do this. The rule is simple, and it covers every name on the list. Turn it over. Read the base before you price it. The muck on the outside is not the story. Every single piece of useful information I've given you in this video, the Kenrick mark and what date range it implies, the Falkirk reproduction and how to spot the filed stamp, the Robinson handle rib, the British Anzani name that sounds like a motorcycle engine, all of it is on the base of the pan. Not on the cooking surface, not in the handle shape alone, not in the color of the rust or the thickness of the crust. The base, the foundry mark, the size number read in context of the maker's specific system. If you build one habit from this, it's that. Every cast iron piece you handle, every one, before you price it or pass on it or put it back on the shelf. 30 seconds, turn it over, find the mark. I said at the start of this that with cast iron, not knowing is optional. I meant it. The information is on the object. The only question is whether you look. Now, before you go, a thought. Everything I've said about foundry marks and size numbers and condition applies to one other category of British cast ironware that turns up in exactly the same places: old trivets and griddle plates. Same makers, same stamps, same value gaps, same condition rules. A Kenrick trivet with a clean mark is not a decorative afterthought. A Falkirk griddle plate is not a garden ornament. The same names, the same method, the same money. If you know what you're reading. That's the next one. If you've found a maker's mark on an old cast iron pan and you're not sure what you're looking at, put the name in the comments. I'll tell you what it's worth, and if this has been useful, and I hope it has, the subscription button is there. I'll keep putting this out as long as people want to hear it.